Hi everyone, I'm Dhilshan. I used to debate for Royal College, and I'll be doing a debrief on the motion of the 5th round of the SWRD Bandaranayake Debating Championship 2025. The motion reads, this House prefers the establishment of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, or TRCs, to attempts at pursuing retributive justice. Examples are prosecuting perpetrators in post-conflict states. There is an Infoslide that will be added to the description of this video. This motion is pretty similar, even though not exact, of the round 2 of WSTC 2024. I think there's a debate between Bulgaria and Philippines. I haven't watched the debate, the entire debate myself, but I presume it's pretty good, so do check it out if you have the time. Before we get into the arguments and clashes, a lot of the teams were confused by what exactly each side needs to defend in this motion at the tournament. Some teams, including really good ones, interpret this motion as prop having to defend the establishment of TRCs in order to pursue retributive justice. Phrasing of the motion aside, there are a few indications that can point out and tell us that this definition is wrong. I thought of three. The first is that TRCs and retributive justice are usually opposites to one another and achieve relatively different goals. So we can look at like real world examples like South Africa and Yugoslavia, so one doesn't inherently lead to the other. The second thing is that the way this motion is structured can tell us this as well. We can see the two attempts being paraphrased to as opposed to attempts, given that the word attempts is also in plural. The third thing, and probably the most important reason, is that this is a this House prefers motion, where 9 times out of 10, a counterfactual to what Opp has to defend is given in the motion itself. The only real exceptions to this are motions where the counterfactual is blatantly obvious, those counterfactuals usually being status quo. An example of a motion like this is this House prefers a world where people can't lie, where the counterfactual that Opp needs to defend in that motion is status quo, where people can lie, and that's something that is quite obvious. To summarize, Prop has to defend the establishment of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in post-conflict states, and Opp has to defend the pursuit of retributive justice in post-conflict states. This clarification is very important because if you're Prop and you go first and you tie all of your impacts to achieving retributive justice, then you're making the concession that retributive justice is very important. A good opposition team can then make the clarification, flip all of your impacts, and at that point, you've already lost the debate because your analysis actually proves the opposition burden. Similarly, if you are opposition and you run a completely different counterfactual, regardless of how well you prove that counterfactual, you still lose the debate as you can't pick whatever counterfactual is convenient for you when it's given in the motion and you haven't proven your burden. This means at the end of the day, no matter how well you attack proposition, you don't have a positive comparative to stand on, which means you will lose the debate. This can be a very frustrating and unfortunate way to lose the debate that even some of the best teams at that tournament were victim to this mistake, so make sure to keep an eye out for this. We'll start with Opp Setup. I think the largest question you should ask when you get proposition in this motion is what exactly Truth and Reconciliation Commissions will look like. So there are 4 ways you can set this debate up holistically. A, you can say the TRCs would be made collectively and have equal representation from all the states affiliated. International bodies such as the United Nations would also play a limited role in serving as watchdogs, appointing commissioners, and providing technical expertise. You can also say that civil society actors would aid in this pursuit too. The second way you can set this up is by saying that we'll make this as accessible as possible. We'll use local language translation services and translate it or broadcast as well, and would also travel to the victims rather than making the victims travel to us. The third thing is in terms of buy-in. You can say that the TRC would have the power to grant amnesty to those who share their wrongdoings, showcase remorse, and offer appropriate apologies for their actions. This applies across the spectrum, from soldiers on the ground to the generals who gave the orders. We can also have the power to declare our standards by saying that high-ranking generals will have to also give up the names of their co-conspirators in order to gain full amnesty, at least in comparison to low-ranking soldiers. The second point of setup, and you don't have to focus on this as much, is just briefly characterize what Opp's world will look like. You can say that Opp supports the pursuit of retributive justice, which is arresting as many people as possible that were involved in this conflict, and a focus on incarceration, rather than the pursuit of truth and reconciliation and fixing the structural issues that led to this conflict. So there are 2 broad arguments you can run if you're proposition. The first argument is on why this system is better for victims. The first thing you need to prove in this clash is that there will be buy-in for the TRC. This part of the argument is quite important because if people aren't willing to collaborate, it's very easy for opposition to push you around and mitigate your impacts, which means strategically you will lose the debate as well. You can prove this and prove buy-in through 3 stakeholders. The first stakeholder are victims. You can see the victims want to approach the TRC because it's a safe and anonymous environment with private spaces and psychological support where they can articulate their trauma. Incentives to engage in this exist because they want a platform to express themselves after years of being silenced and being told that they don't matter, and we give them that safe space. You can see that soldiers want to have certain level of buy-in because not all soldiers with the same bloodthirsty and bi-dimensional characters that most people make them out to be. There are several soldiers who are coerced into war due to the fear of punishment, economic reasons, or literal death threats to them and their family. Leaders probably want to buy in because we can threaten them to prosecute leaders, which motivates them to plead guilty and avoid jail time, and we think most people just don't want to go to jail. Then you can prove that it's better for victims given that you prove buy-in. How can you prove that it's better for victims? There's a bunch of ways you can do this. This is a non-exhaustive list, but there are a few ways that I've compiled. One is by saying that the TRC focuses on finding the dead bodies of victims' loved ones through investigations and DNA identifications. This is not only on the basis of prosecuting individuals, but as a means of an end in and of itself. So we give victims some closure and the ability to say their final goodbyes, perform religious burial rites to come to terms with the grief and the imperative to move on. The second way is by saying that we give victims autonomy and agency. So your story gets in the record regardless how well you can substantiate your story with evidence. And that's a hard thing to acquire in times of war in comparison with retribution, where there's a lot of issues that you might face. One issue you might face when you're trying to only tell your story through trials and courts is that defense lawyers who can cross-examine and rip apart your testimonies and distort your trauma. In the same extent, with frequent witness intimidation, where courts can decide which part of your story matters and which part of your story doesn't. This is dangerous because you can be in the courtroom where your abuser that you know abused you can be declared not guilty simply because you don't have enough evidence to prove that your testimony actually happened. So what we give victims in our comparative is the ability to control your story, gives a unique form of catharsis, and at the same extent, incarceration can't offer any of these things, which is a prerequisite to move on. The third thing you can say to prove that victims are better off on propositions world is by proving that retribution gives incomplete justice. You can prove this through a bunch of ways, right? One, you can say that even if some people were thrown to jail, it's not justice if it means that your abuser is still a war hero and his legacy still lives forever in the hearts of the people. So it doesn't matter if he's in jail if people are still willing to support this individual and it doesn't give you the same extent of closure. Now it's important that you weigh here, right? Because an obvious op push is that your abuser not going to jail and walking free also affects closure and catharsis. So you need to weigh this off, and there are three ways I think you can do this. One is by saying that people are more proximate to society's opinions. If they keep talking highly of your abuser, that probably hurts more as well. But two is that opinions and truth actually matter to victims because your legitimacy is tied to people's opinion of this individual. If this person is still seen as a war hero, people make you out to be the bad guy for testifying and sending the hero to jail. The third thing you can weigh off here is by saying that incarceration has no guarantee to be permanent. That these individuals might walk out or get out later on or might never be convicted in the first place due to there being bad evidence. So now when they walk out, even after, let's say, a few years in jail, they leave with their legacy is intact. In proposition, even if evidence is slim, the fear of going to jail pushes leaders and generals and other war criminals to confess because they simply want to avoid any amount of jail time. The second argument I think you can push is on why a TRC better enables reconciliation. The reason you can say this argument is important is post-conflict states are some of the most volatile and fragile states to ever exist. There's a lot of blood that has been shed and there's a lot of pent-up anger, and people oftentimes are still divided to an extent. Even more importantly, there's likely to be a large degree of misinformation and misrepresentation of the conflict that took place. This is probably due to people's biases, and the victor often controls the narrative, which only fuels hatred. You need to prove two simple things in this argument to actually be able to prove it completely. The first thing you need to prove is as to why retribution worsens reconciliation. You can say that every sentence and indictment can be used to prove bias of whoever is arresting people. So in any debate about post-conflict states, it's important to realize that no one is happy and everyone has been hurt to an extent. And all the parties still antagonize whoever was on the opposite side. So in this specific debate, if you do have certain degree of retribution, regardless of what happens, either you sentence the war criminals in your side and that was far too harsh and they didn't deserve to go to jail in the first place, or the people in the opposite side, their punishments were inadequate. What this proves in and of itself is that retribution can never actually lead to reconciliation because no one is satisfied. Either you were overpunished or either your opponents were underpunished, And the implication of this is that all communities feel attacked and refuse to believe in the legitimacy of this retribution. The reason this exists is because everyone has suffered to a certain extent, and there isn't the acknowledgement of that collective suffering. Now that you've proven this, you then have to prove that retribution worsens the narrative as well, and the way you can do this is through three ways. One, you can say that when the worst war criminals are taken to trial, they can claim victimhood by using inflammatory language to rile up their supporters and empathizers. But two, you can say that the chance of them feeling ethnic hatred is quite high as well, where because no one is willing to make those concessions and they're refusing to plead guilty, they're going to jail anyway, which means you can actually rile up more conflict, especially in a state that is as fragile as this. The third thing you can say is that retribution doesn't allow the victims' voices to be heard. Rather, it just arrests people without giving them a real platform to talk about their suffering, and the truth behind the crimes are still blurry. The second thing you need to prove in this argument is on why the TRC actually changes this and fixes the problems that we've pointed out that retribution actually has. There's a few ways you can do this. One is you can say that the TRC deconstructs the glorification surrounding the war. This is through A, leaders apologizing to avoid jail time, undermining the legitimacy and revealing that these wars weren't solely defensive or justified, and making the concessions that they also committed atrocities in return for this amnesty. But B, even if only a few soldiers confess guilty, it exposes the cracks in the army solidarity as a unit driven by one cause. So soldiers turn from respected heroes to unwilling victims of coercion. And if you think about it, this is actually enough to prove that all the dangerous language that is inflammatory that retribution fuels might be mitigated by this. But see, it's harder to delegitimize victims' testimonies by accusing them of confessing just for political motives, of getting people arrested. So when a mother cries for her dead son, it's not a lie, and it's not so that she can put someone in jail. The reason she's crying is for her dead son and for her dead son only. The implication you can point out using this piece of analysis is that the TRC deconstructs the moral infallibility associated with the army, or the idea that the army is never wrong and always heroic, making it harder for leaders to justify their blind violence. So even if you've only proven these 2 points, it's likely enough to win the debate, but there are extensions to these ideas. One such extension is that you humanize those involved in war. 2 stakeholders here as well. One in terms of civilians. You can say that we give civilians a platform to illustrate that this war created victims on all sides, that it does not matter which side you were on, regardless of where you were, you always lost a loved one and everyone fundamentally can relate to that. Soldiers as well can expand the narrative to include those in the middle. So soldiers that were coerced into war through conscription, fear of punishment or desperation can depict their side of the story as well, deconstructing the narrative that all who were involved were inhuman, bloodthirsty sociopaths. So the narrative that whoever took part in the war ought to be ostracized is also broken down, which allows them to integrate back into society easier, especially if you're a soldier who was from the losing side. The implication of all of this is that even if hatred doesn't disappear completely, now that the other side has been humanized to some extent, you create the first steps to collaboration, reconciliation, and a gateway for peace. An important consideration at the end of all of these things is that in opposition, either you'll have a low conviction rate, which means that there's a lot of criminals that face no repercussions whatsoever, or a far too high one, that there's no party that is happy and it causes more inflammation. Depending on what op strategy you've run into, you should run your case regarding and basically adjust into this as well, and call out any of their claims that say that they can have the perfect sweet spot of convictions, because that is utterly impossible. Also, this extension you can run, and maybe as a third argument, is that there are a lot of parties that have fueled the war that are basically doing it behind closed doors. This looks like funders, companies that profited off the war and dealt in illegal weapons dealings and chemical dealings. So basically what you're trying to prove here is that you will never find out about these corporations that are basically the backbone of wars and conflict in opposition's world, because there's no any incentive to actually out these individuals in the first place. In proposition, through amnesty deals, a lot of these parties were arguably even more evil than the generals that caused the war, because their motive to kill people isn't ideological, but rather money, and now they can be boycotted, and this is unique only to proposition's world. So now moving on to opposition's ideas. In setup, you'll have to explain what retribution entails. Often a government body, maybe with the support of various international organizations, prosecuting and taking those involved in war to trial. Juries can consist of different backgrounds, assuming the prop has the system as rigorous as I mentioned in my explanation, and they can be as unbiased as well. You also have the fiat as opposition to claim similar structures and similar unbiases. So Opp's case is quite straightforward. You just have to prove that arresting people is a good thing, and that matters more than the truth. You also owe to prove that retribution in this specific case leads to the road of reconciliation as well, at least to the same extent that proposition claim this as well, because reconciliation, I think, on both sides matters to an extent. So, two arguments Opp can run to. The first argument Opp can run is on why the TRC is ineffective. There's a few things you need to point out right at the top of your speech, mostly in response to Propp's claims. One, you have to point out the limitations of the TRC. You have to mention that the TRC relies on buy-ins and confessions. That means people, out of their own volition, must be willing to come and talk about the crimes they committed and confess. There's nothing forcing that can actually happen that can get people to give up these pieces of information. And this has a few implications. A, it damages, and the reasons why they're unlikely to give up this piece of information is A, because it damages their potential political futures. They might have powerful connections with those in powerful places, making any concession damaging to their careers in the long run. And they'd much rather take their chances in court. Note that this is a double-edged idea to run, because it can also be a reason why TRCs are far more safer. But with the right balance of language, it can be a really good idea you can push. The second thing you can do to prove as to why people simply are not going to give up and there will be no buy-in is that opening up to the crimes that they committed opens these individuals to more dangers and attacks. Their own supporters might retaliate against them because they feel betrayed, and other people that will harm them, now that you've legitimized the crime you've committed, might also attack you even more so, and not only the leaders, but also the leaders' families and the generals' families. The third reason you can give as to why people will want to not have any sense of buy-in is because they might fear further prosecution if they concede, and they might not get a proper amnesty, etc. So now that you've proven that in most instances buy-in is something that is unlikely, the second thing you can prove here is as to why the TRC really doesn't do much. That even if you do force them to give concessions, people still walk around quite freely, and even the buy-in to this narrative is questionable. So just make sure that you question anything the prop takes for granted. So even if some people make concessions, supporters are usually blinded by this and claim some conspiracy, right? They can say that the reason why this person made the concession is because of torture or coercion, or they come up with some excuse to say that my guy is still the good guy. The third thing you can use to prove this argument is say that as long as these people still walk free, the potential for them to rise up in power again and gain political positions still exists. They might be able to rally supporters, and this is quite terrible because it delegitimizes any claims against them, and they might even cause more ethnic conflict. The fourth point of analysis you can use to prove this argument is that people might just forget. So this is a stretch, so don't go claiming extremely high impacts, but the punishment of stigma does deteriorate over time as people basically acclimatize to status quo. So as a result of this, many people might give excuses in the long run, especially if they're quite wealthy and they can live very wealthy, comfortable lives. That means the only real punishment is incarceration to guarantee that people in political power that have a large amount of power actually are going to go punished. The fifth thing you can use to prove this argument is in terms of biases that exist in the TRCs too. So if Prop claims that we can't strike the perfect balance, neither can they, and don't let them get away with it. You can say the people that are conducting these investigations might also give more weight to testimonies that they personally believe in before they reach the final verdict and write in those papers. So those controlling the narrative might also end up having terrible results as a result of them being humans and also having biases as well. So if Prop runs any different argument, integrate these responses to this argument and just deal with it with a chunk of their pushes. This is important and strategic because retribution is a very straightforward concept. TRCs are not. Like, they take the risk of refusing to make arrests and to find out about the truth, and they have to make the concession that bad people will always roam free in Prop's world. So you need to acknowledge this as opposition. That means you just have to prove that their system is terrible, and once you do, the easy counterfactual to prove is retribution, i.e. your comparative. So the point of this argument is to claim that Prop's best case is highly unlikely and the reality of things are far worse. The second argument you need to prove as opposition is just why this affects the victims terribly. The simple principle line y'all can run is that an apology simply isn't enough. The blood that has been spilled, your life, your joy, your family has been massacred, and the pain is just far too high, and truth doesn't matter if actions don't support it. What you need to then prove then is that victims don't really care about it. Even in Prop's best case, where war criminals do make these concessions and apologize for their wrongdoings, they simply don't care because the only way you can satiate the pain caused to them is by causing suffering to those that cause suffering to them. The second thing, and this is quite responsive, is by saying that information can still be gathered in Opp's world, and victims still have a chance to voice their pain in courts and trials. While you still have to investigate and do research, this points out that even if you have some amount of information in Prop's world, you can co-opt a lot of those benefits in your world as well. The third thing to prove the second argument here is that victims may lose hope. You know these people are evil, you know that they made these concessions, society also knows they're evil, but nothing is done to them. And the thought of them living happy, fulfilled lives in their mansions can be quite suffocating, especially to victims that have lost loved ones, which means you also lose hope in the justice system. The implications of all of these things is the victims that were affected by this, that now see these people roam free, might refuse to get involved in politics and become apathetic, refusing to give further testimonies because it feels pointless. The fourth thing you can use, and this is quite important, is in terms of revenge, by saying that it's terrible for reconciliation and rather causes even more conflict. One of the main principles of the justice system, and the lesser known one, is to exact revenge through the state so that other people won't have to do so by themselves. If we think the government doesn't exact revenge for us, it's highly likely that in these post-conflict states, people might have pent-up pressure and might take their own vengeance to their own hands and might exact revenge by themselves. This is terrible because they might do things that are drastic or extreme, which might be terrible for reconciliation and might fuel further conflict. It only takes one gun to be shot, one bullet to kill, and that's enough to fall back into another civil war. So this debate can be quite confusing. I do recommend doing a lot of research into Yugoslavia and South Africa and the way that these TRCs do function, but these are like the broad ideas you all can run. The clashes were integrated, so I hope this was useful.